1875, a guy called Eugene Dühring, who had recently been appointed as an assistant professor of sorts at the University of Berlin, announced his conversion to socialism, more specifically a sort of anti-Marxist kind of socialism. He began producing a really long series of volumes sort of explaining what he meant by this. But the real essence of his message was that he believed there was something of a harmonious compromise that could be made between the capitalist class and working people, and this was kind of in opposition to the Marxist take of the time, which was that there would only be true socialism if working people took control of the means of production. Dühring was also a fervent nationalist and anti-Semite, going as far as to publish a treatise titled The Jewish Question as a Racial, Moral, and Cultural Question in 1881. So naturally, a man named Friedrich Engels, who was a Marxist, was not a fan of Eugene Dühring. Engels saw him as a troublemaker for the German communists at the time, who had a fairly united front against the capitalist interests of that country. And Dühring was accused of sowing divisivism by using his sort of xenophobic commentary and anti-revolutionary commentary. Interestingly enough, Dühring was not well liked at the University of Berlin, and he was actually stripped of his credentials after about a year. So by 1878, Engels had composed a response to Dühring's platform, which he had published in a serialized form, but eventually released as one book, and this became known as Anti-Dühring. In 1880, Paul Lafarge, who was Karl Marx's son-in-law, requested that Engels produce an abridged version of the book to be published as pamphlets and used as literature that could be handed out by communists. This abridged form became a document that we know today as Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. The first chapter of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific begins with a discussion of how revolutions in the late 1700s and early 1800s emancipated workers from serfdom, but quickly provided antagonism as capitalists who controlled the majority of property and industrial infrastructure expanded their interests and seized more and more of the spoils of the new economic system. Engels says that because these revolutions had formed some sort of allegiance with capitalists, they had ultimately failed in their attempts for gains toward the working class people. Engels also criticizes utopian socialists at the time for seeing socialism as something that could be an outgrowth of the present system, arrived at via, I should say, the change of heart of the ruling class. They certainly believed that the bourgeoisie, sort of out of a sense of moral imperative or desire for justice, would bring about socialism, and Engels didn't necessarily think that was the case. Engels ultimately dismisses these early attempts at socialism from capitalism by pointing out that they all argue the inevitability based upon a sense of social or moral imperative, but that social and moral imperative is identified as being different in most cases by the philosophers who argue in favor of it. And he points out that it's impossible for there to be a universal truth if those philosophizing on what it could be disagree on what the universal truth actually is. In chapter 2, Engels begins by discussing the growth of dialectic materialist thought. This term basically refers to a system of thought that A, takes into account the interrelation of different concepts through time, and B, understands time as sort of a process instead of a series of states, right? Like everything is constantly feeding into the next thing, influencing the next thing that happens. And he disagrees with this concept that sort of history should be viewed as like these epochs, right? It's more so that like one thing always leads to the next. So he distinguishes this from materialist thought that was theorized originally by a guy known as Hegel. For one, Engels saw human thought as being an abstraction of reality, whereas Hegel viewed human thought as being kind of wherein reality is formed. This was problematic as Hegel eventually contradicted himself by arguing that the human condition as it presently stood represented kind of like a culmination of evolution or history, and this ignored the part of materialist thought that identifies history as being a constant process of change. Thus, it lacks the need for an inherent universal truth or goal. And this also means that socialist theory was not necessarily an invention of man, but kind of like a natural outgrowth of the procession of history. In chapter 3, Engels identifies that the guiding force of history is the production of what is needed to sustain human life and the exchange of said goods. Thus, he argues that political change is more of an economic issue than a philosophical one. Presently, the bourgeoisie controls production, but the productive capacity of industrialism has already outgrown the abilities of capitalism. So this growth began when production shifted from being more solitarily based in a feudal society to being more socially based in a capitalist industrialist society. So we went from tradesmen, tradespeople who largely worked on their own using raw materials that they acquired themselves and then finished products that they sold themselves, to a system where we have factories and many individuals working together to produce goods. Simultaneous to this happening, we have the capitalists moving in and seizing ownership of the product which is produced by a social workforce. So now the sale of the commodity is not actually controlled by the people who produce said commodity. Engels argues that this has a destabilizing effect in terms of supply and demand. This happens because workers produce goods in exchange for pay, which they then use to purchase the goods that they need themselves, thus reducing the social connection that comes alongside the sale of the goods by the laborer that produced them. The laborers are out of touch with the actual demand for the production of goods. In a more direct economy, the producer also sells the goods, and this means that they have a better grasp of what the needs of the consuming public actually are. This fluctuation in a capitalist economy means that there can be more frequent surplus or shortage of goods, which leads to a fluctuation in exchange value, which is the sale price of any given good. This fluctuation is a source of antagonism to workers. Engels claims that this leads them to grow radicalized over time. And then in turn, that is exacerbated by automation inside of a capitalist system, which reduces the need for laborers and subsequently the amount of pay that laborers can receive while simultaneously increasing production. But because a capitalist economy requires those workers to turn around and then buy said goods, it's problematic that they have less pay now because they can't actually buy the goods that they're supposed to in order to sustain the economy. In this, the productive capacity of capitalism quickly outpaces the actual demand of the economy. Engels points out that in 1865 this led to a recession, and then he projects that these recessions would occur under capitalism roughly every 10 years. Now, capitalism does actually have a natural tendency to avoid these fluctuations, but it does so by creating monopolies so that smaller interest groups can control more of the economy and therefore appropriately adjust for the needs of the economy. The problem is that these increasingly small groups of people who control the market tend to operate it in a much less appropriate fashion in terms of what workers actually need. You know, they operate mostly in self-interest. Generally what happens when trusts form is that the government steps in and attempts to break said trust, or the industry in which the trust is operating is then nationalized. If the trust is just broken, the cycle begins again and a new trust begins to build. The other option is for the government to nationalize the industry, which is prone to trust formation, and this can have positive benefits for working people, but ultimately only does well for the proletariat if the proletariat has some sort of direct control over the government. Engels points out that this essentially means that both the capitalist and the state are unnecessary. So this whole book should be read as a refutation of Dühring's desire for there to be a compromise between capitalist interests and socialist interests. If you keep capitalists around, their only purpose will be to extract profit from working people and then use that profit to leverage for more control in a society. Engels argues that socialism can only be attained by workers actually seizing the means of production. Eventually, this leads to the abolishment of the state and the capitalist class. This is a pretty short read and does a good job of breaking down some of the stuff that you'll find in Capital Volume 1 by Karl Marx. There's a modern day lesson here too, which is that the Marxist analysis of politics should always maintain that any sort of capitulation to capitalist interests is ultimately bad and not serving in the interests of working people. And furthermore, it's unnecessary.